The spawning pools of the Scarlet Dominion glowed with ancient fire, casting red shadows across the obsidian walls. Emperor Rathmore watched as his brood emerged from the sacred waters, each hatchling breaking through their crystalline shells with fierce determination. His kind, the Drath, had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 cycles through one simple truth: only the strong deserve to live. 15 hatchlings pulled themselves onto the warming stones. They shook their wings and roared their first challenges at the universe. Rathmore felt pride swell in his twin hearts. Each one looked perfect, their scales gleaming like polished armor, their claws already sharp enough to rend metal. These would become warriors worthy of his bloodline. Then he saw the 16th shell crack open. The last hatchling tumbled out in a graceless heap. Where the others shone brilliant crimson and gold, this one's scales were dull, almost gray. One wing bent at an angle that made Rathmore's veteran eye recognize immediately as deformed. The tiny creature mewled weakly, unable to right itself on the stone. The other hatchlings moved away from it instinctively, already understanding what their father had not yet spoken aloud. High Advisor Skorath approached, his age scales marked with the scars of 100 campaigns. He looked at the weak hatchling, and then at his emperor without needing to ask the question. They both knew the law. The law was older than their civilization, carved into their very instincts by millions of years of survival. "The void awaits, my emperor," Skorath said quietly. Rathmore stared at the struggling hatchling, something uncomfortable twisted in his chest. An unfamiliar sensation he did not understand. He had cast out weak offspring before, as his father had and his father's father. It was mercy, really. A creature like this could never hunt, never fight, never survive the harsh realities of the universe. To let it live would be cruelty. Yet his claws hesitated. "My emperor," Skorath prompted. The weak hatchling had managed to roll onto its belly. It looked up at Rathmore with eyes that glowed dim amber instead of the fierce yellow of its siblings. In that moment, something passed between father and offspring. Some recognition that Rathmore immediately pushed away. He was emperor. He did not feel doubt. He could not afford weakness in himself any more than he could tolerate it in his bloodline. "Prepare the pod," Rathmore commanded, his voice hard as neutron-forged steel. "Follow the old ways." Skorath bowed and summoned the attendants. They brought a small escape pod, barely larger than a feeding trough. It was designed for this purpose, used throughout Drath history to dispose of genetic failures, while technically honoring them with a warrior's departure into space rather than simple execution. The attendants placed the hatchling inside. It made soft chirping sounds that Rathmore forced himself not to hear. He watched as they sealed the pod and programmed its trajectory. They would send it far from Drath space, toward one of the unclaimed spiral arms where primitive species crawled on their little worlds, unaware of the vast empire surrounding them. "Course set for the third planet of System Sol 3, an attendant reported. "Primitive mammalian species detected. Pre-industrial civilization. No threat to the Dominion. Acceptable," Rathmore said. The pod would crash there. The hatchling would die quickly, he told himself. It was more mercy than nature would provide. The pod launched from the ceremonial bay, a streak of silver against the black of space. Rathmore watched it disappear among the stars. His other 15 hatchlings were already beginning their combat training, snapping at each other in the practice halls, learning to bite and claw and dominate. They would become magnificent. He turned away from the viewport and walked toward his throne room. His empire demanded his attention. The Dominion was expanding into the outer reaches. 3 lesser species needed to be conquered before the lunar cycle ended. He had fleets to command, worlds to claim, enemies to crush beneath his imperial might. Yet that night, alone in his private chambers, Rathmore dreamed. He saw the weak hatchling tumbling through space, calling out for a parent who had abandoned it. He saw it burning through an alien atmosphere, helpless and afraid. He woke with his claws clenched and his twin hearts pounding. It was necessary, he said to the darkness. The strong survive, the weak perish. This is the way. But for the first time in his 300 years of life, Emperor Rathmore wondered if the way of his ancestors might be wrong. He crushed that thought immediately. Such thinking led to the decay of civilizations. His empire stood firm because it did not allow sentiment to weaken its foundations. He returned to sleep and did not dream again that night. Or if he did, he refused to remember when morning came. There were worlds to conquer after all, and an emperor had no time for weakness. Not in his bloodline, and certainly not in his heart. The weak hatchling's pod continued its journey through the void, traveling light years toward a small blue world where a very different kind of strength was about to change the course of galactic history. Rain hammered against the roof of the cabin, the kind of heavy autumn storm that turned the Oregon forest into a symphony of sound. David Warren sat at his desk, reviewing field notes about the wolf pack he had been tracking for the past 6 months. His work as a wildlife biologist meant long hours alone in the woods, which suited him just fine. He had grown comfortable with solitude in the 3 years since Hannah died. The thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the windows. David looked up from his notes and frowned. That had not sounded like thunder. It had sounded like something large and metallic slamming into the earth. He knew the difference. He had served 2 tours as a combat medic before finding his calling in conservation work. He pulled on his rain jacket and grabbed his emergency pack and flashlight. The sound had come from somewhere northeast, probably near the old ravine. He headed out into the storm, his boots squelching through mud as he followed his instincts through the dark forest. 20 minutes of hiking brought him to a scene that made no sense. A crater smoked in the middle of a clearing, trees knocked flat in a circular pattern. At the center lay an object that definitely did not belong in an Oregon forest. It was a pod of some kind, about the size of a compact car, made of a metal that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light of his flashlight. Symbols covered its surface in a language that looked like someone had carved flowing fire into the hull. David approached carefully. His scientific mind told him this was impossible. His gut told him to run and call the government. His heart, the part that had spent years learning to read the suffering of injured animals, told him to check if anything inside was hurt. The pod had cracked open on impact. Through the gap he could see something moving. Something alive. David pried the opening wider, metal screaming in protest, until he could reach inside. His flashlight beam fell on a creature that made him freeze. It looked like a small dragon from a storybook, except this was real. About the size of a house cat, covered in scales that shifted between gray and dull copper in the light. One of its wings was clearly broken, bent at an angle that made David wince in sympathy. The creature made a sound somewhere between a bird's chirp and a whimper, its eyes a pale amber color, fixed on him with unmistakable fear and pain. "Easy now," David said softly, using the same tone he used with injured deer. "Let me help you." The creature tried to scramble away but only managed to hurt itself more. David could see it was weakening fast. Blood, darker than human blood, oozed from cuts along its side. He had minutes, maybe, before shock set in too deep to reverse. He pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the creature, ignoring the weak attempts to bite him. He knew injured animals lashed out. It did not mean they wanted to fight. It meant they were terrified. He secured the bundle carefully and began the hike back to his cabin, moving as smoothly as possible to avoid jostling the broken wing. Back home, he cleared his workbench and laid out his veterinary supplies. He had equipment for treating wildlife, though nothing in his training had prepared him for an alien life form. But anatomy was anatomy. He could see where the wing bones had fractured. He could see where the creature was bleeding. He could work with what he understood and hope the rest followed the same biological logic. He gave the creature a mild sedative, carefully calculated based on its body weight and what he knew about reptilian metabolisms. It fought the medicine at first, then slowly relaxed. David worked through the night, setting the wing as best he could, creating a splint from lightweight materials. He cleaned and sealed the wounds. He started an IV drip of fluids mixed with basic nutrients, praying that what sustained Earth life might work for whatever this was. By dawn, the creature was breathing more steadily. David had set up a heated enclosure using equipment he normally reserved for injured reptiles. The dragon-like being lay curled on soft blankets, its chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed stable. David sat in his chair and stared at what he had done. He should call someone. The military. Scientists. This was beyond anything he was qualified to handle. This was first contact with alien life, and he had just performed emergency surgery on it in his cabin like it was a wounded eagle. But he looked at the sleeping creature and remembered Hannah in her hospital bed, so small and fragile, with tubes and wires trying to keep her alive. He remembered how the doctors had said there was nothing more they could do. He remembered holding her hand and promising he would always protect things that could not protect themselves. "I'll call them later," he told himself. "After you're stable. After I know you'll survive this." The creature stirred in its sleep and made a small sound that might have been contentment or might have been pain. David reached out and gently touched its head, careful not to disturb the bandages. The scales felt warm, almost feverish, but that might be normal. "You need a name," David said quietly. "You fell from the sky like a burning ember. Is that okay? Can I call you Ember?" The creature's breathing deepened, as if it had heard and approved. David knew he was being foolish, projecting human emotions onto something alien. But he had always been good at reading animals, at understanding what they needed even when they could not speak. This creature needed safety. It needed care. It needed someone to believe it deserved to live. Over the following weeks, David fell into a routine. He kept Ember warm and fed, experimenting with different foods until he found that she preferred raw fish and seemed to digest it well. He changed her bandages daily, monitoring the healing process with careful notes and photographs. He talked to her constantly, explaining what he was doing, though he had no idea if she understood. Slowly, impossibly, Ember began to heal. 6 months had passed since Emperor Rathmore cast his weakest offspring into the void, and in that time he had conquered 4 star systems, expanded his empire's borders by 12 sectors, and crushed 2 rebellions before they could take root. By any measure, he should have been satisfied. His reign was absolute, his power unquestioned, his name spoken with fear across half the galaxy, yet every night he dreamed of the weak hatchling. In his dreams, the tiny creature called out for him. Sometimes it was dying alone in the cold of space. Sometimes it had crashed on that primitive world and lay broken among alien trees. Always it looked at him with those dim amber eyes and asked a question without words. "Why did you not love me enough to let me try?" Rathmore woke from these dreams with his claws tearing through his sleeping platform. He told no one about them. An emperor who showed doubt would find his throne challenged. His kind respected only strength, only certainty. To admit he questioned the ancient laws would be to invite civil war. But the dreams grew worse. They invaded his waking hours. During a strategy meeting about the invasion of the Outer Rim territories, he found himself staring at a star chart and wondering which of those tiny dots was the system, Sol 3. During a ceremonial feast celebrating victory, he barely tasted the food, his mind replaying the moment he had turned away from the weak hatchling's departure. His military advisor, General Crane, noticed first. After a council meeting where Rathmore had been unusually distracted, the old warrior requested a private audience. "My Emperor," Crane said carefully, "you have seemed troubled these past months. Does an enemy threaten the Dominion?" "No enemy threatens us," Rathmore replied, his voice sharp. Too sharp. He saw Crane's eye ridge raise slightly. "Then what troubles the greatest warrior our people have known?" Rathmore stood silent for a long moment. He walked to the observation window of his throne ship and stared at the stars beyond. Finally, he spoke words he had never intended to say aloud. "Do you remember my last spawning, General?" "I remember, my lord. 15 strong hatchlings, a glorious brood. There were 16. Crane said nothing. He knew where this was going. Every Drath who had lived long enough had participated in the old ritual. It was the foundation of their strength as a species. "I cast out the weak one," Rathmore continued, "as our law demands, as my father did before me and his father before him. The genetic failures cannot be allowed to dilute the purity of our strength. This is the way," Crane said, but his voice held a question. "Is it?" Rathmore turned to face his general. "I have asked myself this question for 6 months now. Why do I dream of this one hatchling when I have never dreamed of the others I have culled? Why does it haunt me?" Crane considered his words carefully. He had served Rathmore for 70 cycles and knew the Emperor valued honesty from those he trusted. "Perhaps because you wonder if you made a mistake, my lord. How can following our most sacred law be a mistake? Laws were created by those who came before us," Crane said slowly. "They were wise, but they were not gods. They could be wrong." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Another emperor might have killed Crane for such blasphemy, Instead, Rathmore felt relief that someone else had finally spoken the doubt he had been carrying alone. "I need to know," Rathmore said. "I need to know if the hatchling died, if my decision was the only possible path. I cannot lead our people forward while looking backward at ghosts. What do you propose, my Emperor?" "Find the pod. Track its trajectory. I want to know where it landed," Crane bowed. Within 3 days, the Empire's best trackers had traced the pod's path through space. They followed the trail of its entry into a small solar system, through an atmosphere to a landing site on the third planet. The world was called Earth by its inhabitants, primitive creatures who had barely discovered how to leave their own planet's orbit. The trackers reported something unexpected. The pod had not been destroyed on impact. In fact, its emergency beacon had transmitted for several hours after landing before being manually deactivated. Someone had opened it. Someone had taken what was inside. Rathmore felt his twin hearts begin to race. His offspring might still live. The thought filled him with an emotion he could not name. Hope? Fear? He did not know. He knew only that he had to see for himself. "Prepare my personal ship," he commanded. "Small crew. Stealth configuration. No one must know where we go or why. My lord, if the Council discovers you have left the capital, let me worry about the Council. You worry about getting me to that planet undetected." They traveled in secret, using older vessels that would not be missed from the Imperial fleet. They moved through uncharted jump points to avoid detection. It took 2 weeks of careful navigation to reach the Sol system, without alerting any of the local species or drawing attention from rival empires. Earth appeared before them, a blue and green marble spinning peacefully in the dark. Rathmore had seen 1,000 worlds, conquered hundreds of them. This one looked soft, vulnerable, weak. Its people still fought wars among themselves with crude chemical weapons. They knew nothing of the vast civilizations that surrounded their little corner of space. "Life signs located near the pod's landing site," reported his pilot. "1 human dwelling. 2 life forms inside. 1 human. 1 Drath signature." Rathmore's claws dug into the armrest of his command chair. Alive. After 6 months on this alien world, his offspring lived. He had not realized how much he had been preparing himself to find only bones until the possibility of reunion became real. "Land nearby but out of sight," he ordered. "I will approach alone. My Emperor, that is unwise. I did not ask for wisdom. I asked for obedience." They landed in a clearing 2 miles from the human structure. Night had fallen over this part of the planet. Rathmore disembarked and made his way through the forest, moving silently despite his size. He had been a warrior before he was an emperor. He knew how to hunt. He reached the dwelling and peered through a transparent panel that served as a window. What he saw inside made him freeze in confusion and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to rage. His offspring was flying. The weak hatchling with the broken wing was gliding clumsily through the air inside the human dwelling, chirping with what sounded like joy. The wing that should have been useless forever had been healed. Not perfectly, Rathmore could see the slight awkwardness in the flight pattern, but healed enough. Healed when it should have died. And there, sitting at a wooden table and watching with gentle eyes, was the human. The creature was small by Drath standards, barely reaching Rathmore's chest if they stood side by side. It had soft skin, blunt teeth, and no natural weapons at all. A prey species. Weak, pathetic. Yet this weak creature had saved what Rathmore had thrown away. The rage that filled the Emperor was complicated. Part of him was furious that this inferior being had dared to interfere with Drath law. Part of him was ashamed that a human had accomplished what he, with all his power, had been too afraid to attempt. And part of him, a part he did not want to acknowledge, was grateful. He did not knock. He simply drove his shoulder into the door, tearing it from its hinges. The crash made the human leap to his feet, and the hatchling tumble from the air with a startled squeak. Rathmore filled the doorway, his scales gleaming red and gold in the light from the human's primitive lamps. He was 3 times the size of this creature, armored in scales that could deflect energy weapons, armed with claws that could rend steel. The human did not run. Instead, he moved to place himself between Rathmore and the hatchling. His hands were raised, not in surrender, but in a protective gesture. His eyes were wide with fear, but also with determination. "Stay back," the human said, his voice shaking but firm. "I don't know what you are, but you're not taking her. Her." Rathmore's voice came out as a growl that shook the walls. He spoke in the human's language. having downloaded it from their primitive information networks on the journey here. You dare name my offspring? You dare claim what is mine by blood and right? Your offspring? The human's expression changed to understanding, then to anger. You're the one who threw her away. You sent her here to die. I followed the law of my people. The weak cannot survive. To let them try is cruelty. She's not weak. She was injured. There's a difference. Behind the human, the hatchling had recovered from her tumble. She peered around the human's legs, her amber eyes fixed on Rathmore. She made a questioning sound, a soft trill that spoke of confusion and caution. She did not recognize him. Why would she? He had abandoned her when she was minutes old. Move aside, human, Rathmore commanded. I have come to reclaim what is mine. Your interference with Drath law ends now. No. The single word was absurd coming from such a fragile creature, but the human did not waver. I found her dying. I spent months helping her heal. She trusts me, and I won't let anyone hurt her, not even her own father. Rathmore took a step forward. The human stood his ground despite the trembling in his legs. It would be so easy to simply push past him, to snatch up the hatchling and leave. The human could do nothing to stop him. But the hatchling did something unexpected. She scrambled out from behind her protector and moved toward Rathmore on unsteady feet. She was chirping now, a sound that held curiosity rather than fear. She stopped halfway between the human and the Emperor, looking back and forth between them as if trying to understand. Then she moved toward Rathmore. Slowly, carefully, the way young things approach something they recognize in their bones but do not consciously remember. She stopped at his feet and looked up at him with those amber eyes. Rathmore felt something crack inside his chest. This was his daughter, his weakest child, the one he had condemned to death, looking at him with innocent trust. His claw extended, trembling, reaching for her. He could snap her neck with a thought. End this mistake. Erase this reminder of his moment of weakness. The hatchling nuzzled against his claw. She made a sound of contentment. Rathmore's hand froze. He could not move, could not breathe. This tiny creature, who should hate him, who should fear him, was offering affection without condition. She did not know he had abandoned her. She only knew that something deep inside her recognized him as family. She's wonderful, the human said quietly. The anger had left his voice, replaced by something gentler. I call her Ember. She's smart, curious, playful. She's been learning to hunt. She's getting stronger every day. You should not have saved her, Rathmore said, but his voice had lost its edge. She was meant to die. Why? Because she wasn't born perfect? The human moved closer, no longer afraid. I had a daughter once. Her name was Hannah. She was sick from the day she was born. The doctors said she would never walk, never talk, never be like other children. They said we should let her go, that it wasn't fair to make her suffer. The human's eyes glistened with moisture, a biological response to emotion that Drath did not share. But we kept her. We fought for her. And you know what? She lived 7 years. She learned to walk with braces. She learned to talk even though it was hard. She painted pictures and laughed and loved her life. She was weak by everyone else's standards, but she was strong in ways that mattered more. Your offspring died anyway, Rathmore said. All that effort and death still came. Yes, she died. And it broke my heart. But I don't regret a single moment I spent with her. She taught me that life isn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the most perfect. It's about being here, being present, being loved. That's what makes life worth living. Rathmore looked down at the hatchling nuzzling his claw. My people believe that weakness is a disease, that it spreads if we tolerate it, that only by culling the weak can we remain strong. And how's that working for you? The human asked. Are you happy? Is your empire at peace? Or do you spend all your time fighting and conquering and proving your strength because you're afraid that any moment of softness will destroy everything you've built? The word struck deeper than any weapon. Rathmore thought of his endless campaigns, his constant vigilance, his inability to trust anyone fully, because trust was a weakness. He thought of his dreams, his haunted nights, his growing doubt that the path of his ancestors was the only path forward. I don't know how to be anything else, Rathmore admitted, and the confession felt like surrender. David watched the massive dragon emperor stand frozen in his destroyed doorway, staring at the little creature nuzzling his claw with something like wonder and terror mixed on his alien features. In that moment, David saw past the armored scales and the fearsome size to something more fundamental. A father who had made a terrible choice and had come here seeking something he could not name. You could learn, David said quietly. Being different doesn't mean being weak. It means having choices about what kind of strength matters to you. Rathmore's eyes, fierce yellow with flecks of orange like dying stars, fixed on him. Your species has not conquered a single world beyond your own. You fight among yourselves with primitive weapons. You struggle to survive your own planet's climate. By what right do you lecture me about strength? Because I saved your daughter when you threw her away, David replied simply. Maybe I don't have your kind of strength, but I have the kind that matters when someone needs help. The Emperor had no response to that. He looked back at Ember, who had started climbing up his leg with her small claws, chirping happily as if this were a game. She reached his chest and settled there, curling into a ball against his scales. The gesture was so trusting, so innocent that David saw the Emperor's expression crack completely. How did you heal her wing? Rathmore asked, his voice rough. Carefully. I set the bones, splinted them, gave her time to rest while the tissue mended. I'm a biologist. I work with injured wildlife. Your daughter isn't that different from creatures I've treated before, at least in the basics. The wing will never be perfect. No, but perfect wasn't the goal. Good enough was. She can fly now. She can hunt. She can live. That's what mattered. Rathmore gently lifted Ember from his chest and held her in his claws, examining her closely for the first time since abandoning her. He checked the healed wing, felt along her ribs where old fractures had mended, looked into her bright eyes that gazed back at him with complete trust. David could see the war happening behind the Emperor's face, centuries of cultural programming fighting against something more primal and true. I should take her back to my empire, Rathmore said. She belongs with her own kind, does she? What happens when you bring her home? Will your people accept her, with her imperfect wing and her small size? Or will they see her as proof that their emperor was weak for saving what should have died? The Emperor's silence was answer enough. David pressed his advantage, not with aggression, but with calm reason. She's safe here. She's happy. I can teach her what she needs to know. When she's older, when she's stronger, maybe then she can decide where she belongs. You would do this? Continue to care for a creature that is not your own kind, that offers you nothing in return? That's what you do for family. Blood doesn't matter as much as you think it does. What matters is showing up, being there, doing the work even when it's hard. Rathmore set Ember down gently. She immediately scampered over to David and climbed up to her usual perch on his shoulder, something she had started doing as she grew bolder. The Emperor watched this with an expression David could not quite read. I cannot simply leave her here, Rathmore said. She is of Imperial blood. She has duties, responsibilities. She's 6 months old, David countered. Her only responsibility right now is to grow up healthy and safe. Everything else can wait. For 3 days, the Dragon Emperor stayed. He did not return to his ship. Instead, he made camp in the forest nearby, watching the cabin from a distance. David knew he was there. Sometimes in the early morning, he would glimpse the massive scaled form among the trees. Sometimes at night, he would see eyes reflecting in the darkness. On the second day, David left food outside. Raw meat, fish, supplies that seemed appropriate for a large carnivore. The food was gone by morning. On the third day, David simply opened the door when he heard movement outside and gestured for Rathmore to enter. The Emperor came slowly, his massive frame somehow managing to fit through the doorway without destroying more of the cabin. He sat on the floor, too large for any of David's furniture, and watched as David prepared Ember's breakfast. The little dragon had developed a routine. She would eat, then practice flying around the cabin, then work on the hunting exercises David had created using toys and treats. Rathmore observed all of this in silence. David did not force conversation. He simply went about his day, caring for Ember, explaining what he was doing and why. He showed the Emperor the training exercises that helped strengthen Ember's healed wing. He demonstrated how he taught her to hunt using progressively difficult challenges. He shared the notes he had been keeping on her development, written in careful human script that Rathmore could not read, but understood from the accompanying diagrams and videos. You treat this as important work, Rathmore said finally. It is important work. She's important. Every life is important. My people would say you waste resources on genetic weakness that should be eliminated. Your people sound exhausting, David replied without malice. Constantly proving yourselves, constantly afraid that any kindness will be seen as weakness. Never able to just enjoy life because you're too busy fighting to stay on top. That's not strength. That's fear wearing strength's armor. The words hung in the air. Rathmore did not argue. He could not, because they were true. His entire existence had been about maintaining power through force, about never showing vulnerability, about making sure every subject feared him enough to stay obedient. It was exhausting. It was lonely, and watching this human care for his daughter with such casual gentleness, he wondered if perhaps there was another way. "Teach me," Rathmore said suddenly. "Show me how you do this, how you care for her without expectation of return, how you find strength and gentleness." David looked at the Emperor, seeing past the fearsome exterior to the confused father underneath. "Okay," he said simply, "but it's going to take more than 3 days. This isn't something you learn quickly. I am Emperor of a star-spanning civilization. I do not have time to—" "Then you don't have time to learn this," David interrupted gently. "That's the first lesson right there. Important things take time. You can't conquer kindness the way you conquer worlds. You have to live it, practice it, fail at it, and try again. That's what makes it real." Rathmore wanted to argue. Every instinct told him this human was wrong, that strength came from dominance, that compassion was weakness wrapped in pretty words. But Ember chose that moment to fly over and land on her father's snout, chirping cheerfully and looking at him with such open affection that all his arguments died unspoken. 3 weeks passed, and Emperor Rathmore learned what it meant to be patient. David taught him how to interact with Ember without dominating, how to encourage without commanding, how to simply be present without needing to control. It went against every instinct the Emperor possessed, but slowly, something remarkable happened. He began to understand what his daughter needed from him, and it was not strength or power. It was simply his attention and his care. But the Empire could not wait forever. His generals sent increasingly urgent messages. His absence was being noticed. Questions were being asked. Rathmore knew he had to return, but he also knew he could not simply abandon Ember again. More than that, he had begun to question everything his civilization had built its foundation upon. "I must go back," Rathmore told David one morning, as they watched Ember practice hunting moths in the early light. "But I cannot leave things as they were. What I have learned here changes everything." "What have you learned?" David asked. Rathmore was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter play with a freedom and joy he had never seen in his own species. "That we have mistaken cruelty for strength. That we have built an empire on fear and called it greatness. That we have thrown away the weakest among us and lost something essential in the process. What will you do about it?" "I will change the law. The practice of culling the weak ends with me. The Dominion will protect all its children, regardless of their strength at birth." David nodded slowly. "That's good. But you know it won't be easy. People don't like changing traditions, especially ones that make them feel superior. There will be resistance. Perhaps even civil war. My advisors will say I have been corrupted by contact with a primitive species. They will call me weak for showing compassion. Are you prepared for that?" Rathmore looked at David with his fierce yellow eyes. "You stood between me and my daughter when I was prepared to take her by force. You, a creature I could have killed with one claw, faced down an emperor because you believed she deserved protection. If that is weakness, then I choose weakness. If that is corruption, then corrupt me further." The Emperor stood and called Ember to him. She flew over and settled on his shoulder, something she had started doing in the past few days. He touched her gently with one claw, the gesture still awkward but genuine. "I will take her with me. She is crown princess now, whether my people like it or not. Her imperfection will be a reminder that strength comes in many forms." "She'll miss this place," David said. "She'll miss you too. And you? Will you remain here content with your small life on your primitive world?" David smiled. "This small life suits me fine, but I'll worry about her, and about you. Changing an empire is dangerous work." Rathmore surprised them both by placing a claw on David's shoulder, the gesture as close to gentle as the massive warrior had ever managed. "You have given me more than my daughter's life. You have given me a purpose beyond conquest. You have shown me that true strength lies not in dominating the weak but in protecting them. In my culture, we have no word for what you are, but I will create one. You are the first teacher, the one who showed a dragon how to care." The farewell was harder than Rathmore expected. Ember did not want to leave, sensing the change even if she could not fully understand it. David held her one last time, whispering words of encouragement, promising that she would do great things. Then he placed her in her father's claws and stepped back, his eyes wet with that strange moisture humans produced when emotions overwhelmed them. Rathmore's ship rose into the sky, carrying Emperor and Princess back toward the stars. Through the viewport, Ember pressed against the transparent material, looking down at the shrinking figure of the human who had saved her life. Rathmore stood beside her, one claw resting gently on her back, and felt something he had never experienced before. Not doubt this time, but certainty. Certainty that he was doing the right thing, even if it cost him everything. The return to the capital was exactly as difficult as predicted. When Rathmore presented Ember as crown princess, the court erupted in chaos. His generals demanded explanations. His advisors called for his removal. The noble houses whispered of madness and weakness. And when Rathmore declared the new law, that no hatchling would be culled for weakness ever again, half his empire rebelled. The civil war was brutal. Those who clung to the old ways fought viciously to preserve their traditions. They saw Rathmore's compassion as existential threat to everything the Drath had built over millennia. But the Emperor fought back with a conviction he had never possessed before. He was not fighting for territory or resources or glory. He was fighting for a principle he had learned from a human in a cabin on a primitive world. The war lasted 2 years. Worlds burned. Fleets clashed among the stars. And through it all, Ember grew. She learned to fight. Not as well as her siblings with their perfect bodies, but with cunning and creativity that surprised everyone. She learned to lead, with a compassion that inspired loyalty more powerful than fear ever had. And she learned to remember the human who had saved her, the one her father now called the Teacher of Dragons. When the war finally ended with Rathmore's victory, the Scarlet Dominion was transformed. The old guard had been defeated or converted. A new generation rose that saw strength not just in martial prowess, but in the ability to nurture and protect. The weak were no longer cast out, but given opportunities to contribute in ways that matched their abilities. The Empire did not become soft, but it became whole in a way it had never been before. Rathmore stood on his throne ship, Ember at his side, now nearly grown, and looked toward the distant Sol system. David would never know the full impact he had on galactic history. His simple act of kindness had toppled an empire and rebuilt it on a foundation of compassion. One human with no power, no weapons, no armies, had changed the course of civilizations by simply refusing to let a helpless creature die. "Father," Ember said, her voice now capable of speech though still young and uncertain, "when can we visit the teacher again?" "Soon," Rathmore promised. "When our empire is stable, when peace is truly established, we will return. And I will thank him properly for the gift he gave us both." In Oregon, David Warren sat in his repaired cabin and looked at the stars. He had watched the news reports of some kind of civil war happening in deep space, though the details were too distant and classified for civilian channels to fully explain. He wondered if Rathmore had succeeded, if Ember was safe, if his small act of kindness had mattered in the vast sweep of galactic events. He would never know for certain. But sometimes, on clear nights, he thought he saw a particular star shine a little brighter than the others, and he chose to believe that somewhere out there, a little dragon with a healed wing was teaching an empire what he had taught her. That weakness is not failure, that compassion is not surrender, that the truest measure of strength is not what you can destroy, but what you choose to protect, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the universe.